Welcome and thank you everyone for joining the inaugural episode of the Business of Compliance podcast. Today we're excited to offer dialogue to you from the industry experts focused on data center and data center services. Our first guest, David Kidd, has been executive in charge of setting strategy and vision for all things GRC for one of the largest data center providers in the world. David, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Dan Thompson is principal research analyst with SP Global, focused on data centers and data center services globally. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. I am senior, yes, by the way, but that's not my title.
6 in one, half dozen in another. Guys, thank you all again for joining me today. As I said, as each of you know, really the focus of the Business of Compliance is to bring your industry expertise and experience to bear to help executives who might not necessarily have a well-formed opinion about certain topics understand additional perspectives so that they can form their own opinion. But today we really hope to focus on your area of expertise, which is data centers and the things that we see changing, not only in the environment around data centers, but in how other executives are thinking about strategy. And so, guys, that said, as you think about the industry, what are the common themes that you see that are most interesting to you as we think about evolution over the next 18 to 24 months?
Wow. Well, I would say, there's a lot of things that we've been seeing in the industry over the past year and continuing to expand into 2024. And one of the most talked about trends right now is AI. And that has an impact not only on compliance programs, which is very challenging because it's brand new. ISO responded very quickly, so we've got some new standards coming out there, but that means this is a new practice area for everybody, both on the certifying side as well as the data center operator and then the end user. It's all very new. And some of the folks in AI are providing AI services as part of a service offering, and that's brand new, not only from a delivery standpoint, but from a regulatory framework. The legal ideas haven't all been worked out. You talk about copyright, you talk about different things there. And then on the data center side itself, just data center operations, the power consumption, you get enough NVIDIA chips in a very small space, and it gets very, very hot. So you've got huge power consumption, you've got cooling considerations that go into there. So even those that have held off on liquid cooling solutions are now saying, okay, we need to bring in liquid cooling solutions.
What do we do?
Design changes.
Yep.
It becomes an engineering process. It becomes an equipment lead time process for construction. It becomes a challenge in dealing with local utility providers. It becomes an issue, in some case with zoning, because you're looking at having more generators for your backup, which means noise abatement and solutions. So it really has a cascading effect when all those artificial minds start to get built in the data center. It's changing the way the business works. It's changing the way the engineering works, as well as the regulatory and compliance framework.
And David, it's so interesting that you mentioned that as your opening example. ISO 42001, which is the ISO standard around AI management systems, or AIMS, was really just finalized at the end of 2023. From an accrediting board perspective, most certification bodies aren't yet in a position that they can offer accredited certifications against that standard. But what we're seeing is that there's such pressure in the market that certification bodies are offering unaccredited certifications and companies are gobbling them up. From an engineering perspective,
some way of demonstrating diligence.
And that's what it is. And really one of the unique things about ISO 42001, not to pull us from data centers, but it really is a certification, a standard around ethical and responsible use of AI, not specifically around security of AI and AI systems. So fundamentally for organizations getting into this, it's a bit of a change. It's a bit of a paradigm shift in how they think about building this management system.
It reminds me somewhat of the shift from physical infrastructure to a cloud model. And there was a lack of certifications and frameworks around it. And to a certain extent, the old ways of doing things and the old assurances still apply. And that's what people sometimes lose sight of. And I think the same will be true in AI. From a security framework, you can apply ISO 27001 to artificial intelligence models. So you mentioned, hey, it's more of an ethics framework around AI rather than a security framework. Well, there are security frameworks and they can be applied. The security standards in SOC 2, they can be applied to AI systems and solutions. There's enough flexibility in existing frameworks that if you build your controls right and thoughtfully, you can apply them in a way even when there aren't AI specific standards out that are in play. So you just have to be thoughtful and creative and think about what you do as a business, because odds are a lot of the things that just make natural sense to you, if they're properly defined as controls and executed well and well documented, can be brought into an existing framework.
And I love
and interestingly, David,
I love what David.
Go ahead, David.
I want to circle back on that one. He was mentioning like the sort of analogy of going from physical infrastructure to cloud. See now going from non-AI to AI, or going from cloud to AI, whatever you want to call it. It's an interesting analogy because, from a data center perspective or from an infrastructure perspective, what cloud did was change the scale of things. And I think what we can confidently say about AI is it's changing the scale of things yet again. And so David mentioned a minute ago, power consumption. We're back to a spot with compliance, as David was just saying, that, like people are scratching their heads saying, how do we wrap our arms around this new thing? And I think it's same exact correlations all the way across, right? We just have to take a step back and remember, well, hang on, this isn't like totally new. It is, what it is doing is new, but maybe how it's doing it is new. But all the same things still apply. Like it still needs power, it still needs cooling. You still have to think about security. You still have to think about the ethics of things. I'm actually like excited that we started with ethics, because it's typically ethics that's the last thing we think about. We even do this and so I mean that's what's interesting. I think to me, just to kind of tease that out a little bit more from your initial question of like what's interesting to you these days. It's absolutely that. It's the power ask for these facilities has gotten so ridiculous. Like every time I talk to a power company, I'm having to suspend reality for my conversation, because we've gone from talking about megawatts and hundreds of megawatts to now gigawatts. And I mean, you think about the capital that has to be deployed just to even build these things is I mean, we're well in the billions. It's a little crazy, but I mean, that's sort of the nature of it all. Of course, there's all sorts of questions around how do we make that sustainable? Is it sustainable? Can that even be done? And then, when will that happen? So anyway, that's sort of top of mind for me. But I love the analogy that David said. This is just cloud all over again. It's just a yet bigger scale.
Well, and sustainability, I know for years for you guys, ESG was one of the common drivers, one of the common themes. Do you see AI essentially stepping on the head of ESG to take that number one seat as it relates to focus for compliance executives or data center executives?
It may suck the air out of the room somewhat in terms of public attention. I don't know that it supplants ESG at all.
Okay.
Because you notice we were just talking about AI, and right away it slipped into, okay, there's ESG implications.
Sure.
And that hits in a few ways. From the ethics standpoint, how do you train the AI to make sure that it's consistent with ethics of your business, ethics of the community, ethics of your industry, and so forth? Beyond that, you start looking at the sustainability question when you're looking at enormous power consumption. You were just talking about how much power the power companies are having to provide, which means they have to change their build out plans for substations. In some cases, even power plant timelines are being shifted and billions of dollars invested. Well, now you look at, okay, how is that power being generated from what fuel source? Is it going to be fossil fuels? Is it going to be some sort of renewable? Is it going to be nuclear? Are there ways that folks are going to look at local generation at the data center? And again, that becomes a new engineering model for data centers, as well as an availability model, which is part of your security triad, is the availability piece. So all of these things connect together, and ESG certainly doesn't go away. I was fascinated a few weeks ago. Someone posed a question to me on LinkedIn about artificial intelligence and said, how are you going to audit these things when essentially they're making decisions in much the way people do? And it was such a delight to me that it was a throwback to my college days, because I did an artificial intelligence project, way back in the dark ages on stone tablets and Navitas, and was designing what we then called an expert system. And I designed a medical expert system. And one of the core functions that I had to build into it, it was an absolute requirement even then, was what they called a why function. After the expert system makes its decision, you can ask it why. Why did you make that decision? Which meant you had a database of the decision tree and all of the inputs and everything that it considered, so you could then determine how the conclusion was reached.
Yes.
And I think that type of auditability and tracking is something that's going to be necessary as we begin to trust these large language models, large visual models. When you talk about, again, medical radiologists, some of the best radiologists out there are Watson from IBM and other artificial intelligence systems, because you have an enormous data pool to pull from. So you have this large model of data, and then it can start examining through all of that and come up with an answer. Well, we need to figure out, how did you come to the conclusion? Did you maybe make a leap, what they sometimes call, imagining the answer, when an AI comes up with an answer and we can't figure out how it came up with it? It's going to be a critical part of artificial intelligence as we go forward, to be able to second guess what this intelligence tells us.
I really agree, David. And to that end, there are some bills currently in Congress, I believe, the Algorithmic Accountability Act, wherein transparency and explainability around how the algorithms function are really starting to take priority. I think the concerning thing is, from a conformance audit perspective, there aren't necessarily good frameworks out there for auditing algorithms. Now, there are a couple of organizations, one group called Babel.ai, who are absolutely leading the way with what it looks like to assess algorithms. But largely, the field has been silent on what it is organizations should do, assessors should do, to step in and actually provide some sort of assurance that the right things are being done with the algorithms themselves. So there's a demand for explainability and transparency, but not necessarily a structure, a framework to do anything with it once we have it.
Beyond the framework, even, I think there's a business opportunity for a technology solution to be developed here. And companies who are first with a reliable, consistent, and affordable solution to, for lack of a better word, psychoanalyze these artificial intelligences and understand their decision process and explain it to others. They're going to have a tremendous opportunity, I think, because having that immutable, audit trail that's verifiable and can be a standard of trust that's applied to the output will be essential, whatever regulatory framework comes in. Whether the EU is first to the game and they drive it, whether Congress somehow agrees on one solution, or whether industry drives it forward themselves. And I suspect the truth of the matter is it'll be a combination of all of those things.
Yeah.
And regardless of the path forward, there's going to have to be a trusted arbiter of the decision-making process that the artificial intelligence makes.
I like what you're, maybe AI,
Yes.
just, AI will discover some new gene that's associated with a disease, and we never had, we didn't know that yet. And so show us how you got there. And then we can peer review that. You guys can do compliance on it. And then, the greater humanity can benefit from it because now we know a new thing that we didn't know before.
And Dan, you just hit on something, and kind of going back to part of our conversation earlier, I do see that we're increasing our dependence on AI, on automated algorithms, on all these things. And there's a little bit of hesitation in some camps and a lot of receptivity in others. But nonetheless, the handwriting's on the wall. AI is here. We have to embrace it. We have to learn to use it in a meaningful way. As more and more people demand access to AI and the various tools, there have to be systems supplying it, systems supplying power, systems supplying cooling. Are we prepared to supply the power that we need and mitigate the heat that's generated? I mean, all those things associated with data centers and what this actually looks like technically. Do we have the infrastructure in place globally today to actually support what it seems is happening in the market?
Short answer is no.
No.
I think, I mean, what we're seeing, let me dial this just to the United States, just to make the conversation a little easier. But what we're seeing across the U.S. is that power grids are absolutely struggling to keep up with any demand, let alone data center demand. But like wholesale, look at any market where there are data centers that are taking off, and what you will find is power companies' forecasts for the next 10 years. So just for those that don't know, power companies always make these what they call power forecasts, which they're basically projecting for their shareholders how much more energy will be required on the grid, how they're going to get it, how they're going to green it up. These days is a normal conversation. Anyway, so if you jump in any city where data centers are going crazy, what you'll find is power companies' forecast models totally just thrown out the window. Not even close. And it's because they're being way overshot by data centers. And what's interesting is, like if we talk about, like how fast are data centers growing across the U.S., depending on who you ask and what date range you use, it's somewhere between 7 and 10% of growth. Now, to the layperson, that may not sound crazy, right? 7 to 10%, that's not outrageous growth. But if you look at power markets, the year-on-year growth of most power markets is like in the single digits. It's not less than single digits. What I mean by that is when you add up all the new homes coming online, all the new businesses entering a city, all these new things, it equals out to about 1% or so of new additional growth. But
so growth is
I'm sorry?
The growth is consumption of power?
Correct. Yeah. Growth is in consumption of power. When you throw data centers in the mix, though, now we're talking like multi-single digit, if not double digit growth in these markets. And so while these numbers may sound small, it's the pace at which they're going that's crazy. And it's like this hockey stick style growth up and to the right. The power companies just from a distribution and transmission perspective can't keep up. In some cases, from a generation perspective, can't keep up. I was reading this thing the other day, and it was talking about in Northern Virginia, between 2019 and 2023, there were 81 new data centers built, totaling it was over 3 gigawatts of power. That's like a 4-year span. And what we're talking about, I mean, like I know these numbers are over most people's heads, like that is multiple nuclear reactor worth of
Yes.
power that data
Right.
centers are consuming. So like this is like not only is it like causing a strain, but like we're adding new generation, and so you have all these questions of who pays for that, who's responsible for the cost of all the underlying infrastructure, not just the generation. And then you also have to ask the question. Communities are asking these questions like, who is benefiting from this? Is it us, the
Yeah.
community, or is it Amazon and Microsoft and Facebook?
Now, Dan, to that end, you've talked about a paradox, and I forget the name of the example that you've used with me.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that if you don't mind?
Sure. Yeah. So there's this thing that what I call the Virginia paradox, and so to kind of give a little bit of just sort of background level setting. So all of the major hyperscalers, and when I say hyperscalers, I mean like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on. They've all set sustainability standards. And so they are all trying to reach carbon neutrality, which means they're basically bringing on as much green energy as they're consuming from the grid. So basically offsetting the amount of power that they're bringing in with clean and renewable energy sources. If you look at the largest corporate procurers of energy across the globe, it's Microsoft and Amazon. Actually, let me say it in the correct order. It's Amazon and then Microsoft. So these companies, in terms of bringing clean energy to the grid, are doing great things. You can't. There's no way around that. However, if you look at Virginia, for example, Amazon and Microsoft and the others are building so fast that they're not able to keep up with their new power demand with corporate renewable purchases. And so you have things like happening with Dominion, where they're going to their shareholders saying, hey, because of these data centers, I'm having to keep my coal-fired power plants online. Not only that, I need to bring on new natural gas power plants just to keep up with the demand from the data center providers. So we have to ask the question, is that sustainable? That doesn't sound sustainable to me. Like if I'm having even though you're doing a wonderful thing, which is bringing on lots of clean and renewable energy, and even though you're doing all these other great social things, if the power company that's actually servicing you is having to delay the closure of fossil fuel fired plants, like where like maybe this works out like in 10 years down the road, but is it sustainable today? And then ultimately, who's responsible for that? Because like if you look at like the Paris Agreement and some of the other agreements that folks are signing on to, trying to clean up and green their energy sources, none of it accounts for what is my impact on the community necessarily. Like thinking of it in these terms, like how am I impacting the communities that I'm operating in? It's basically just an accounting thing, right? I'm bringing on more or as much as green energy as I'm consuming.
It's a balance sheet thing.
Yeah.
And then, David, if you think about this, are there certain technologies that are driving this uptick in demand? Is it AI? Is it virtualization? Is it
Both, actually. I think it's fair to say that it's not exclusively AI that's driving this high demand, but certainly that's the one that's most public facing right now, and it is an extreme consumer where you can have one large AI deployment completely consume a data center, and it be the entire footprint of a large data center be consumed with an AI solution, and that data center itself then becomes a cascade down to substations, plant generation, and to Dan's point, that becomes a tax policy question. Who's going to pay for this? Are there enough jobs generated from this at the market where the cost burden occurs? Because sure, Microsoft employs a lot of people, Amazon employs a lot of people, but they may not be where that data center is or where that cloud implementation is. And with those costs being borne locally, you want to see the benefits locally to help offset things. And that's just from a financial perspective. When you think about carbon, you buy carbon offsets. Well, the carbon offsets don't really change the smoke that's generated by the plant that
One
happens
bit.
in Northern Virginia if
One
you're
bit.
buying offset carbon credits from a wind farm in Texas, for example. While the net to the planet is going the direction you want it to go, the local impact on the community is very different from that global perspective. So that's that paradox that Dan introduced, and how do you wrestle with that? So it's a big challenge, and it's not just AI. It is the process of cyberspace is now where people live and work, and governments operate, and that is just part of our 21st century reality, and it will continue to grow, whether or not these new technologies, whether it be cloud now, AI next, spatial computing next, and edge computing, and the Internet of Things. All of those things are a piece of the puzzle, so you can't lay it out to any one. But certainly, if you have to, the one that's the hot topic now, both literally and figuratively, is artificial intelligence.
And David, this might be an oversimplification, but I almost think that for the executives listening, that having AI policy or responsible use of AI compete with ESG, that almost feels short-sighted, because hearing you guys piece this thing together, they're very complementary. In fact, those two philosophies, those two ideals really work together to ensure that we're doing the right thing, not only for the people consuming our services, but also the community at large. And Dan, I interrupted you. I apologize.
No. I was just going to put some meat on the bone of what David was just saying. So, like, what we're kind of talking about here is when sustainability issues become social issues, and to kind of put this in real terms. So, if you look at Chandler, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix, so they had a time period in their history where they were open arms, bring all the data centers you want. We want to be the next data center hub, complete with tax abatements on new buildings. I mean, basically gave away all the tax dollars that would have come into that city just to get data center providers in there. And the hope was that that these data center providers would bring lots of new jobs, that somehow other tax revenue would be generated as a benefit from these data centers being there. Fast forward to today, though. And the city council has actually, from I guess it was a year or two ago, said, all right, you know what? No more data centers. Because not only did they not bring a bunch of new jobs, but they're also consuming up all our resources, including water, by the way, and they're generating a bunch of noise. There's actually like an interesting lawsuit where I forget if it was the city council, I forget who it was that brought this expert in, but there was an expert brought in to present in front of the council who was able to demonstrate that the Doppler effect actually carries the sound of these cooling units and then the generators when they're running multiple miles across the Arizona, with the Phoenix desert there. And the valley. And so, so it's really interesting. They were able to demonstrate that homes like multiple miles away could hear the sound of these things. Phoenix is one spot. We also see this in Ashburn, where communities have basically made Facebook pages to keep everybody on board with what's happening where. And you will have people show up and protest outside data centers because of the noise. And so in Chandler, as I was saying, the city council said, okay, no more data centers. We don't want them. They use up all our resources. They're not bringing any jobs. And so they nixed it. And so if you are a new data center provider and you want to build in Chandler, you can't do it. You got to go down the road to Mesa or over in the West Valley in Goodyear. And so they just shut the door on it. Interestingly, though, and this is sort of an interesting complement to the whole thing, is that Intel actually built a huge plant in Chandler, which consumes a ton of water, by the way, but it hires a bunch of people. And so there is this sort of balancing act that city councils have to play of, okay, well, how much, what is the value of our resources, not just in dollar numbers, but like if we're going to come up with like a carbon budget or a water budget, what do we want to spend that And you can Patrick, you're shaking your head, and it's interesting because like this, again, like this is where we get into, we have social issues that are now tied to environmental issues, and our community leadership just has to answer the question, what do we want? What do we want for our city, and what do we want for our citizens, and what will the ultimate impact be?
Well, and I'm shaking my head because I made a trip out to Sedona last September and just happened to drive through Chandler, Arizona.
Yeah.
So it was not a green place. It was not a place that I would associate with a surplus of water, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
the thought of bringing in an industry that is so thirsty, so hungry for a resource that's not in natural supply, I mean, it really seems counterintuitive in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I mean it's quite fascinating. I mean this is the one thing that you don't hear a lot about these days. We should hear more about it actually. Is how much water data centers consume through the cooling process. Can literally consume millions of gallons of water per day, depending on how large the data center is.
Really?
Yeah, so it's an astonishing number. Now these are data centers like at large scale, right? Like this is not like a 1 megawatt facility. These are tens or hundreds of megawatt data centers. So it's like a campus. But in any case, that consumes a ton of water, and you're absolutely right. Phoenix is one of the cities in our country that have had water shortage issues. Basically, all the desert states have struggled with this, right? And so, yeah, it's something you need to think about. Do we use there is a bit of a give and take in cooling of data centers, which is you can use a bunch of water, which saves energy, or you can use no water and use a little bit more energy. And so you kind of have to ask the question, which is the greater sin? Like, do we want to spend more energy, or do we want to burn some water along the way? And so, yeah, it's fascinating.
and you mentioned Arizona specifically. I think one of the key words in what you said is data centers can use a lot of water. They can also use very little water. It depends on design. And what happens is in a climate like Phoenix, evaporative cooling is very efficient because you have this very dry environment out there. So you put in an evaporative cooler, you run water through it, and it evaporates off. Well, that takes the heat with it. So you've got the heat rejection that the data center needs, just absolutely essential to keep those computers alive. But it also means that you're taking that water, that precious water resource away, and there'll be just the same type of revisiting the engineering that we talked about because of AI, where you've got this huge power consumption. So you come up with new ways of cooling through liquid cooling, that sort of things, which can be closed systems. Just because I say it's liquid, one doesn't mean it's all that liquid is water. It also doesn't mean that water then goes down the drain. It can be circulated in a closed loop system. But you can look at how data centers are designed, and normally I would say 3 to 5 years. That's sort of the de facto standard when you're talking about changes in the market. I don't think it's going to be 3 to 5 years. I think it's going to be more like 12 to 18 months. Data center designers are going to say, you know what, the plans that I have sitting in my AutoCAD directory, and I just sort of pop them out every time I want to build a new data center. I can't do that anymore. I'm going to have to design something new because of the expectations of the community in terms of noise, resource consumption, power consumption, cost to operate, all of those factors.
David, that actually begs the question. Earlier, I talked about an organization out of the EU had pursued and earned their unaccredited ISO 42001 cert. So they had their AIMS evaluated. They're actually an earth moving company. So they do these massive earth moving projects. They're using AI in their platform to effectively design how to best manipulate landforms for whatever the use is. So are people using AI today to design data centers, or is that something that's even part of a conversation?
That is not something in my personal experience. It would not surprise me to hear that someone somewhere is looking at all those factors. I mentioned how these things feed into one another. And we mentioned the tie between ESG and AI, and is that really a tug of war, or are they complementary? I think, a good example of that is, while ESG programs can apply to AI models and very quickly make sense when you look at the ethics of AI and other factors, environmental being. You can also flip that and have AI applied to ESG to say, okay, if these are your goals, here's how you can accomplish these goals. So it can apply one to the other, and you could transform that into a tool for data center design, where you start modeling out the environmental impacts, where you start modeling out the economic and social impact of not just the build and the engineering, but the lifespan and operations of that data center, and look at large volumes of data to detect patterns that AI can recognize that teams of human beings would not be able to recognize. And that's just the power of AI. It can take things like, for example, there was a machine learning back before the AI was machine learning. In Canada, machine learning system recognized if you wanted to be a great hockey player in Canada, and of course, every kid in Canada wants to be a great hockey player, you need to be born in August. And everybody was scratching their head. That didn't make any sense. Why does what day you're born matter? And finally, lack of a why function. So they started teaming through all of this data and figuring out what was going on. Well, what came into play was a boy born in August had almost an entire year extra before he had to go into school. So he was bigger, he was faster, he was stronger than his peers when they entered school. So when he was hockey league eligible grade, that meant that he was physically more ready. So your better players were not. And it's going to be the same type of thing, where you take these complex models of what are the economic impacts of a data center? What are the environmental impacts? What are the social impacts? What's the noise issue that we can do? And build these large models. So I could definitely see the potential for AI to apply to not just the design, but the operations of data centers. Haven't seen it yet, but you know what? Nobody had seen ChatGPT just a number of months ago. So things change quickly.
So David, a very direct question, and Dan, I see you want to say something. I'm sorry to cut you off. Very direct question for our listeners that intend to take what you just said and build a new service from it. Are you available for consulting?
I will gladly help anybody who can help improve the industry, because I think there's a lot of potential for us to help people and help communities and make life better for folks. And that's exciting stuff.
Thank you. And Dan, again, the floor is yours. I apologize.
No worries. I think what I was going to say is, like, the near-term application of AI and data centers is, I think, that the last thing that they said, which is operation. I think there are, I know there are a number of providers of like DSIM tools and various data center management and monitoring tools that are working on having the machines make decisions about machines. The question is when do the humans become comfortable with that? And when do the humans actually get good enough data into these systems for the machines to make quality decisions? And that's always been the problem with DSIM. DSIM is data center information management systems. So basically being able to, draw from all the sensors, the many sensors that are deployed in the data center to kind of make good decisions about, are there hot spots on the data center floor somewhere? Is there a piece of machinery that's about to fail? How can we know that? All of this data could be accessible. It's just a challenge getting these things set up. But I think that's where we'll see it first, or that's at least the hope of it all. I will say, though, and David, I hope you'll agree with this, but also not be offended by it. The data center industry is typically like slow to adopt change. I think rightfully so, actually, because if you think about data centers as infrastructure, we want these things to be up. Uptime and resilience is obviously a very big thing in the data center world. And so, like what I typically remind people is that innovation is usually found on the back of failure. And failure is not what you want in a data center. And so I think that's part of the driving reason why the data center industry can be slow to adopt new things. So we'll just have to wrestle this out. But I think near term application of AI in data centers will be the operation of it all. I don't think data center techs have any worry over their jobs anytime soon. Frankly, I think we'll always be double checking the decision before it gets actually made. Hopefully what it does is just leads to quicker, maybe a little bit wiser decision making on those techs, on the part of the techs.
And guys, you all are both clearly thought leaders in this field. David, extensive experience as an executive, setting strategy for data centers. Dan, research analysis globally of what data centers are doing. If you could offer our listeners, executives, 3 things that you think are most important for them to consider and take action on in the next 12 months as it relates to their businesses, their data center businesses, what would those 3 things be? David, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. I would say one of the biggest things you can do is have a conversation. And that conversation should include not just your leadership team and your technical experts within your organization, but your customers and other stakeholders as well, so that you have the best information available, because things are going to change rapidly. And Dan made the point that I absolutely agree with. As infrastructure providers, we're slow to change. High availability is the expectation, so we're slow to change. Well, change is born out of crises. Crises are looming. Power just being one example that they alluded to. And there are others as well that we can talk about at other times. But have those conversations. And then after you have those discussions to help build out your strategy, put the strategy in writing so that you have a single unified direction that everybody has stacked hands around. And that's where this interplay of engineering and ESG and compliance programs and all these different elements can come together. And that would be the last thing, just being a governance, risk, and compliance guy at heart, although I've been on the data center operations side as well. Put together a risk model for all those things that you're wanting to achieve, and come up with a risk management and a compliance program that reflects those goals and values that you've all agreed on. And that allows a level of trust to be shared among everybody that's involved. So those would be my 3 off the top of my head.
And just to layer in really quickly, Dan, I'm so sorry to continue to interrupt. To layer in really quickly, from my perspective, particularly for those execs that do look to pursue ISO 42001, 2 areas that I think are of most concern for me, for you, center around your AI risk assessment, having a methodology and a standard and a scoping, quite frankly, your own understanding of your organizational context of use of AI is something you absolutely have to nail down sooner rather than later. So your risk assessment specific to AI, and then your AI impact assessment, which largely is going to be net new for those of you not currently doing something associated with privacy. Those things are things that you really need to wrap not only your head, but your hands around, so that as we get into real enforcement of things like the EU AI Act, which might not be a big thing for our domestic listeners, but for our foreign listeners, this will be a big deal. Those are significant concerns for me, for you. And Dan, again, I apologize to interrupt. Your thoughts?
I think, well, just to play off of what you just said, even though this is the first of these legislation that are coming out of Europe, I mean, I think we've all seen a GDPR, while it was a European regulation, had implications all across the globe. So I wouldn't be surprised if something similar doesn't play out in this realm as well. But I mean, I think, just to kind of jump on, some of your all's thoughts. I mean, if I'm an exec listening to this, there's probably one of two stances that I have. One is I'm jumping all, actually, there's probably three. I'm jumping all in on the AI. I want to use it however and whenever, and I'm going to, I'm planning on getting rid of people already because we can use AI to do their jobs. Number one, you're crazy. Number two, there's probably people who just don't know about it and are just kind of wait and see type mentality. And then there's people who are afraid of it. I'm sure there's other categories, but if we just kind of work off of those three, like what I would say to folks is, like if you're already thinking about canning people, slow your roll. If you've got your head in the sand and if you've got your head in the sand and you're just sort of scared of it, like what I would say is now's the time to at least learn about it. Let's not be scared of it. This is legitimately a way that we can improve our work output. I think we're maybe not there yet, but we will be there. And so the question is how do we take people and train them to this new way of work? How can we upskill folks, not just get rid of them? And so I think that's something that we all should be thinking about. But to me, like my big three things, I was going to say this actually even before David spoke, which is just take the time to learn and understand what AI is, how it could be used within your organization, and then also pump the brakes a little bit and ask, where does this introduce new risk to my organization? There's lots of things to consider here from an ethics perspective, from a copyright perspective, just from a trust perspective with you and your customers. Are your customers okay with you generating something for them that was actually created by a machine and not a person? Are they comfortable with that? And I think until everybody's on board, we just need to be very transparent about what's happening. And that's one thing. The other thing is, like, as we're planning for these new data centers and as we're planning for new infrastructure, it behooves us all to be very transparent with the power companies. Data center providers have sort of gotten a little bit of there's a little bit of stigma around them with power companies, in that data center providers commonly would go to power companies saying, hey, I'm going to need 100 megawatts. And then 5 years later, you're using 10 or 2. The power companies absolutely need us to be better at planning, like what the actual load is going to be. I know that's a challenge if you're a co-location provider, because at the end of the day, it's your customers that are actually going to be drawing that power, and you kind of have no say. But in any case, we need to get better at planning so that these power companies aren't just absolutely blowing their forecasts, so that we're not introducing extra burden on the grid and creating challenges for the citizens that live around it. We also need to be thinking about the water consumption of our data centers. And then lastly, just to kind of put a bow on both of those thoughts is really, if you don't have a sustainability program in place today, let's get on board with that idea. Like, this doesn't have to be a wokeism. This doesn't have to be greenwashing. This could just be looked at as being a responsible steward of the resources that we have. It can be as basic as that. Like, you don't have to set the sustainability goals that are like moonshots. Just say, next year I want to be a little bit better than I was this past year. And what does that look like from your organization, and what seems practical to you? I think this is very much an instance of rising tides lift all ships. And so as long as we're all walking in the same direction, we'll eventually get to our goal. It's just a matter of we got to start sometime. This isn't going away. And oh, by the way, there are different loan vehicles out there that are available to folks who are doing things in a more green manner. And so if you are a person that's trying to build data centers and you want a lower cost of capital, it's actually in your favor to have a sustainability program, because different loans or financing companies are looking at that. And so this can be a great benefit to you and your business.
Good coaching, Dan.
Green bonds can build data centers.
That's right.
Guys, thank you. Thank you all so much.